Να καλωσορίσω τώρα τον επόμενο ομιλητή, τον καθηγητή Αρμάν Νταγκόρ, διακεκριμένο καθηγητή κλασικών σπουδών στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Οξφόρδης, ο οποίος έχει αφιερώσει τη σταδιοδρομία του στη μελέτη της αρχαίας ελληνικής γλώσσας, φιλοσοφίας και τέχνης. Στην ομιλία του, με θέμα αρχαία ιατρική και καινοτομία, θα εξετάσει το πώς η αρχαία ιατρική, παρά το γεγονός ότι αναπτύχθηκε σε μια εποχή περιορισμένων τεχνολογικών μέσων, συνδύασε την παρατήρηση και την κριτική σκέψη για να δημιουργήσει θεμέλια για την καινοτομία στην ιατρική που εξακολουθεί να έχει απήχηση και σήμερα. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome Professor Armand Dangoor, renowned professor of classics at the University of Oxford. Professor Dangoor is a distinguished academic who has dedicated his career to the study of ancient Greek language, philosophy, and art. In his talk titled Ancient Medicine and Innovation, he will explore how ancient medicine, despite being developed in a time of limited tools, employed observations and critical thinking to lay the foundations for medical innovation, a legacy that continues to resonate today. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, Eugenia and Xenia, to speak to this distinguished audience of doctors, oncologists, and so on. So I'm going to, here we are. I was asked to speak about ancient Greek innovation and medicine because innovation is one of the things I have done a lot of work on in relation to ancient Greece. Now, there is a book that came out in 2014 called The Lagoon, some of you may know it, which has the subtitle, How Aristotle Invented Science. And it's a wonderful book. It talks about Aristotle's biological investigations and how he used systematic empirical methods to study thousands of living creatures and to create essentially what we consider to be a scientific method. In fact, it was written by a namesake called Armand Marie Leroy. And a few years later, when I wrote a book and went to the same publisher, Bloomsbury, the publisher said, I'm going to have to publish your book because I want to corner the market in Armands. So it was quite useful that Leroy had written this book. However, what I want to suggest is that the origins of scientific method go back to Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, a century before Aristotle. And we know from the Hippocratic corpus, and I understand that you've heard today about Hippocrates and some of his ideas, that he came up, the corpus that goes under the name of Hippocrates uses a lot of terminology that we still have today. So it was the origins of words like acute, chronic, epidemic, endemic categorizations, talk about different stages of illness, relapse, resolution, crisis, paroxysm. These are all words and terms that come up in the 5th century BC already. Conditions like diabetes, paralysis, sepsis, and so on. So we have a lot of words, and of course they're all Greek. It's a huge advantage and a huge, you might say, a privilege for people to be able to speak ancient Greek because if you're in the medical world, it's about Greek terminologies of this kind. Plato is a little bit dismissive. So in his Republic, he says there's a conversation with Socrates where Socrates says people fill their bodies with fluxes and wind. So he uses remata and pneumata, like in a marsh, he says. And they make ingenious physicians come up with terms like reflux and catarrh. Isn't that terrible? And his interlocutor says, yes, such newfangled terms are quite absurd. Of course, at that period, so Plato writing in the early 4th century, these feel like new terminology for things that we've always understood, wind and so on, flatulence, coughing. And so when we hear words like, here we have, of course, catarrh, and he says, physaste kai catarrhus. then, you know, these become standard medical terms, but at the time he says, "Os lithos ken tafta ke atopa nosimato nonomata." And it reminds me of a friend of mine who's a medical surgeon in the UK, who, whenever he loves inventing new terminology for various conditions. Recently, he said to me, he'd invented a belt, which if you put on, you gradually can decrease your stomach. And he wanted a word for this that sounded medical. So I gave him a few Greek words, and he ended up with lipoatrophia piezogenica. So the reduction of fat that comes about through pressure. So you may even come across this term in a medical journal, lipoatrophia piezogenica. There we are. If you're Greek, it's not a problem. If you're English, it sounds, well, atopa, kena ke atopa, newfangled and absurd. So one form of innovation clearly is to come up with neologisms, but it's not the most important one. Of course, Hippocrates' innovation, the most extraordinary innovation for the 5th century BC, was to move from folkloric medical cures. Here's a herb that you can use to cure yourself, or here's a magic spell, or an incantation, or a prayer, to move from that to the empirical observation of patients. And so in the Hippocratic corpus, there are about 60 medical treatises, not by Hippocrates himself, but possibly one or two might be by him, but others are not, from a period from the 5th and 4th centuries, books that include titles such as On the Art Peritechnes, on old medicine. Interesting, he's interested in telling us what the medical practices of the old days were, peri Archeis Iatrikis, peri hieris nusu, that's what of course they called epilepsy, the holy disease. But he goes out of his way to say there's nothing holy about it, it is purely organic. So this is a rationalization of what disease consists of, about diet, because above all they had to use diet, dietary methods, drinking and drinking water perhaps, or abstaining from certain foods in order to try and get a cure. And a lot of surgical things, a periarthron, periagmon, perigynecion, a lot of women's diseases. But above all, the epidemiae, the visits, and that's really what it means, visits to patients where you take a very careful history, as we just heard how important history is, very careful history of the patient in order to diagnose, but more importantly, to offer a prognosis. Where is this going to go? And these extraordinary treatises that exist, I think the epidemics, as they're so called, are the most extraordinary because you have extremely detailed observation of patient conditions. So this is the beginning of really empirical science. If we find out exactly what the background of this patient is, what they've been eating, what they've been drinking, what the weather was like when they got ill, and day by day we find out how that patient responds to certain treatments like drinking or not drinking, eating or not eating, resting, and so on. And one of the amazing things about the epidemics is that so many of the patients die. And this is something, I mean, in ancient Greece, you have a highly competitive world in which a lot of the systems that were being presented were success-oriented. But the doctors decided, we're not going to just say, we gave them this treatment and it worked. They could absolutely honestly say, this is what happened to the patient, and very often, unfortunately, the patient died. So here's an example of a very short case study. This is actually one of the shortest. You have to look in the epidemics for a 5 or 6 line study. You get this one maybe. Kritoni en thaso podos odini erxatoi skiri apodactylu tu megalu orthostadin periontis. So he was seized with violent pain in the big toes. He walked around. Went to bed the same day, shivering, nausea, regained some warmth. At night was delirious, paraphronisin. Day 2, swelling of the whole foot, rather red about the ankle and distended. Black blisters, acute fever, delirium. The doctor noting down what's happening on day 2. Intestinal discharge, thick, bilious, and quite frequent. Died day 2 after the condition began. So, just straightforward observation, facts, and the doctors who wrote some of these treatises said things like, if we collect enough of this, we will get to know exactly how health and disease works in the human body. What we need is just a massive empirical observation. Now, of course, we know that's not enough. We need scientific understanding. It's not something they had, but this was the beginnings of working out that by observing with precise detail, you can get to a better understanding of what works and what doesn't. Now, I wrote a book in 2011, The Greeks and the New, and one paragraph of that says the Greeks' legacy of innovation in art and drama, logic and mathematics, medicine and historiography is embodied in surviving artifacts, living traditions, and an unparalleled assortment of written texts. The latter indicate implicitly and explicitly numerous ways in which people thought about and reacted to the notion of the new, in matters great and small, and in relation both to lasting innovations and fleetingly ephemeral novelties. And then the question I wanted to ask is, what did it feel like to be surrounded by new objects and ideas? What did it mean to be conscious of new experiences and eventualities? Did all these forms of novelty encourage the seeking out of new paths of thought and action, or were they a disincentive to innovation? So this was what I was trying to get at, as I said in the subtitle, Novelty in Ancient Greek Imagination and Experience. And of course, one of the great periods for innovation was the 5th century BC, the growth of Athens and the Athenian Empire, when so much felt novel, so much felt as if it was changing in society and in intellectual life. The Hippocratic medical advances must have been part of that sense of the innovationist aims of the Greek world at the time. But the funny thing is that when I wrote the chapter on medicine, it seemed that they were not interested in what is new. So we have this opening on ancient medicine, peri Archaeas Iatrikis, as it's called, the Ionic dialect. They say, Oposimen επιχείρησαν περί ιατρικής λέγειν, η γράφειν, υπόθεσιν αυτής, υποθέμενη, το λόγο, θερμόν, η ψυχρόν, η υγρόν, η ξηρόν, η αλλοτοθύρο, and telos, and whatever they say, they're adopting this hypothesis, postulate, hot, cold, wet, dry, whatever else, reduce the underlying principle, Αρχαία, of causation of human disease and death to a narrow compass, in postulating one or two elements, and the same elements in all cases of illness. They're clearly on the wrong track. In my opinion, says the author, and this could be Hippocrates himself, medicine requires no new postulate. So where I was finding a lot of evidence for the promotion of novelty in ancient Greek society at the time, here we find the opposite. We don't want anything new. There's no new medicine. It's all the way it's always been done in the past. That is, it reminds me of that film, Strictly Ballroom, where the examiner says, there are no new steps. So don't try and innovate. What we should be doing is seeing how the body works and seeing how the cures work. So what are the principles of innovation that were being espoused? I boiled this down to 4 conditions, and I've written a fairly popular book in 2021 called How to Innovate, an ancient Greek guide to creative thinking. First of all, you need the conditions for innovation, and those include open thought, so to be able to risk new thinking, which of course you had much more in the case of, say, democratic Athens than you would have done in the tyranny of the 6th century, which was overthrown by Cleisthenes. Incentives, some kinds of rewards. There are wonderful examples of these incentives that were set out for people to create innovations. Aristotle actually suggests that there should be a prize for coming up with new constitutions, he said, in his Politics. Competition, which we know is a very competitive society. So that's the background. You need these conditions for innovation to thrive. And then within those conditions, there are 3 common mechanisms. And virtually every innovation that you will find is a version of one or other or a mixture of these 3. And they are cross-fertilization, it's taking 2 separate things and bringing them together. I mean, today's medical world, of course, we cross-fertilize our knowledge of medical conditions with modern technology. So that's clearly what innovation involves today. Adaptation, which really just means building on the old in order to create something new. And reversal, so an idea that you can simply say, look, let's do it completely the opposite from the way it's been done. So these are the mechanisms, and we can find them in many different examples. Now, I'm going to take Plato's Symposium. You may know this. It's the dialogue in which various speakers talk about what is love, eros, and it goes round in a circle, beginning with Phaedrus and Pausanias, Aristophanes, the comic playwright who talks about human nature. And then we have a doctor, Eryximachos. And Eryximachus says that love, eros, is about balance and harmony. And he says, I will talk about my own discipline, which is medicine. And so he says, what medicine is may be summed up as knowledge of the desires of the body and how best to satisfy or deny them. The best doctor is one who can distinguish good desires from bad, so what is good, what the body loves and what it hates, and who can convert one into the other. To be able to generate desire where it's needed and to implant it or remove it is what makes a truly skilled practitioner. He must reconcile the most hostile elements in the body so that they learn to love each other. This idea of harmony in the body is what makes you well. Disharmony is the opposite. So these are the elements that are most opposite to each other. And then he mentions the so-called the principles that we have seen in the Hippocratic text: cold and hot, bitter and sweet, dry and wet, and so on. So he knows, Eryximachus knows what the current thinking is about the principles within the body that need to be harmonized for people to be healthy. And he says, I believe when the poets say that my ancestor Asclepius, they call themselves Asclepiads, of course, the descendants of Asclepius, knew how to implant love and harmony in these elements. That was how he established the profession. So this idea of balance, it's not entirely alien from modern thinking about health and disease either. And no doubt as oncologists, you might think of the balance between cell growth and cell death, things of this kind, which have a philosophical background, not a purely medical one. But we can see how philosophy, in this case, the philosophy of love, in that wonderful dialogue, the Symposium, might be used to think about how medicine actually works at base. So, adaptation, well, once the Hippocratic doctors had produced these treatises, and actually writing them down was itself an innovation in the 5th century BC. This was the beginning of written treatises. And then, of course, doctors were able to build on that. Herophilus and Aristoteles, they investigated the human body, they created anatomy, nervous system, the brain. They looked into, they identified ventricles, extraordinary advances in the Hellenistic era, and then all of this was collected and compiled by the millions of words written, they reckon around 10 million words, by Galen of Pergamon, physician, surgeon, philosopher, much of which was preserved in Arab sources, such as this 13th century book, Kitab al-Dariyak, Book of Antidotes. So we find that this moving on from a solid base of empirical knowledge led to a great advance in Hellenistic times. And then, of course, the Hippocratic Oath, I think, is an example of a reversal of a kind, because what you find is that it begins with an appeal to the divine characters that in Greek tradition were considered to be the patrons of health, Asclepius, Apollo, Asclepius, Aegea, Panacea, all the gods and goddesses, but then goes on to talk about things which we recognize today still as central to how physicians should behave. I will not give a lethal drug to anyone or advise such a plan or cause an abortion, so first do no harm. I will not use the knife, even upon those suffering from stones, but will leave this to those who are trained in the craft. So be discerning about treatments and about the limits of your ability. Into whatever homes I go, I'll enter them for the benefit of the sick, avoiding impropriety, so act ethically, don't seduce the women or the men. And whatever I see or hear in the lives of my patients, which ought not to be spoken of outside, I will keep secret. So the notion of patient confidentiality. These things are quite revolutionary thoughts of the period. They're not things that we find previously. They are enormously innovative. So thank you very much. That is all I will do.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this wonderful talk. Questions, please. Microphone, please. Μικρόφωνο, παρακαλώ. Εδώ, να, έρχεται.
First of all, I'd like to mention that Professor Armand Dangour is not only a classical professor, but he's a great musician. He plays professionally the cello.
Yes.
And so I would like to say that I see a moral in this Congress that all of us are artists, and secondly, that interdisciplinary is the utmost art. That's all. Thank you.
That's true.
Thank you very much, Nikos. Yes. I do think that interdisciplinarity is indeed enormously important, because one of the principles of innovation, as I said, was cross-fertilization. So if you're thinking, well, this is what leads to success in music, you might come up with an angle, a new angle about anything else that you're doing. And as Callie talked about earlier, if you're a historian, you might be thinking about ways of doing things in the past that were good or were bad. It's a different perspective. Perspective is what it's all about. Einstein said imagination is more important than knowledge. How do you get that imagination? You broaden your perspective in whatever way you can. So thank you. I agree. Interdisciplinarity is very important.
Any other questions, please, from the audience? Yes? No? Someone? Okay,
It's been a long day. You don't have to speak.
Christo?
Afraid of you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Oh, no, there you go. Can you turn it on?
Indeed. What was the spark for this massive burst of innovation? And do you see any connection or similarity with our era, where we have a burst of technical civilization? Every 3 years, technology changes, our mobile phones change, our capabilities change every 3 years. We're inundated with massive innovation, technological innovation. Technological innovation,
Yes.
not spiritual innovation.
No. Yeah, I mean, this is an excellent question. What sparked the great efflorescence of the 5th century? Actually, though, I would probably say of the 8th to the 3rd centuries BC, so 500 years perhaps, of innovation. Where did it come from? And there are a number of answers. First of all, the position of Greece. It was very well positioned between the East, a lot of Eastern influences we know, a lot of influences from Egypt, which Herodotus tells us about. So the Greeks, being traders and being able to visit and trade in different parts of the ancient Aegean and beyond, managed to bring in a lot of important ideas. And Plato famously says, what we Greeks do is we find other people's ideas and we improve them. And actually, if you think about the Greek alphabet, it came from Phoenicia, from the Levant. But if you look at the Levantine method of writing, it's very irregular. And what the Greeks did is they geometrized the letters. So we have these fantastic letters with beautiful geometrical proportions. So that's one of many different answers, the position of ancient Greece. But if you think about Athens, the democratic revolution of 507 BC, and the freedom of individuals to express themselves and to think, the growth of a population, very important to you. The more that a population grows, the more you have interactions. So with the Athenian Empire, you had intellectuals coming from all over the Greek world to Athens and then going back out into their islands, into their cities. And the other thing was, what I mentioned briefly, was the use of writing. So once you had the alphabet, probably perfected around 700 BC, by 500, 450, you start getting books. And that allows for much broader dissemination of ideas and for critique. And critique is essential. And it's something the Greeks were very good at. They criticized each other. And when I was once asked, what about, China and Confucianism at the same time as Socrates? If you look at the two systems, they are so different. Socratic method is all about asking questions and not being satisfied with answers. The Confucian method is, this is the way it should be done to have a harmonious society. This is completely the opposite. That critical understanding led to enormous growth of thought. And actually, I think one of the things that shut it down was the focus on military conquest. Alexander the Great, the most successful military conqueror of the ancient world, shut down so much in terms of intellectual and cultural thinking. But this is a brief answer to a very difficult and important question. Why did it happen then? Of course, what happened then was then picked up many centuries later in the Renaissance. So what we understand about ancient Greek is filtered through Renaissance scholarship. And they will have picked certain things and left out others. There's a vast amount we don't know of the time. But one of the questions that constantly vexes historians is how an essentially agrarian society, farmers, peasants, and so on, turned into this extraordinary intellectual society which produced drama and logic and mathematics and science in the end of it all.
Would you say that the Persian threat gave the final push, and the existential fear the Athenians felt gave the final push to this current of innovation of every
yes, I think
in every domain?
I think absolutely right about the existential threat from the Persian Wars, 490, 480. The extraordinary sense that this tiny country, by compared to the vast empire, had succeeded against all odds. And, of course, famously, Herodotus says it's because we believe in eleftheria. And even if the Persians win, they will still be slaves to the great king, whereas freedom is what drives us. That is the kind of freedom that led to the democratic constitution of Cleisthenes, to Parrhesia, Isigoria, these principles that were espoused from the late 6th century onwards. As I say, possibly shut down somewhat by the Empire of Alexander, but before, in that amazing 150 years, you can see that. And I think the existential threat from Persia is one aspect of it, though we shouldn't forget there was a lot of interaction with Persia as well, and some cultural exchanges. Even the great sculpture of, say, the Athena on the Parthenon of Phidias was thanks to seeing colossal sculptures in Persia. So we shouldn't assume it was entirely a hostile relationship.
They discovered a big world outside Athens, because till then they thought everything was among them, except Egypt, of course.
Yeah.
So we don't believe that the world is just around medicine. So actually, I'd like to thank you for being here. And with this wide spectrum of your thoughts here, I can say that this contributes very much to what we were discussing here today. So I enjoyed very much this small book. Actually, I just downloaded this.
Thank you very much.
And the description of the evolution from infection, inflammation, sepsis, and death is exactly how a young physician would describe this today. If somebody is by the bedside, this is exactly how it's happening today if the patient gets out of control. So this is part of the art of medicine, because this is what we teach the new physicians.
Clinical observation.
So in the evolution of this, we said about the different principles, the disciplinarity of the sciences, all the bridges between the sciences. So we discussed this before. I can tell you that there are many great physicians who are musicians, and actually some of the best. And actually there are examples that are like one of the breast cancer specialists was playing the violin, one of the experts in gastric cancer who came actually from the eastern countries is in New York now, and Dr. Zanzigiani is actually playing the violin. So I believe that what we want now in medical training is that the physicians have exposure to different principles. They have scientific curiosity about everything, and they're just curious to find themselves within, the whole knowledge. I put this together in a book. I invited Tάκη Θεοδωρόπουλου in one of my conferences in the way thinking differently. You don't have to think like a physician. You have to think differently like everybody else does. So I just want to say thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.